There is a kind of knowledge that does not come from classrooms. It does not come from books read in comfort or lessons learned from people who never really suffered. It comes from the kind of life that breaks you and then waits quietly to see what you do with the pieces. This is a story about a man who was broken and what he built from the rubble. His name was Niccolò Machiavelli. And if you think you already know him, the villain, the manipulator, the man behind the word Machiavellian, then what history sold you is the edited version, the safe one, the one that keeps you from understanding what he was actually saying. Because what he was saying was not about politics. It was about you. It was about the hidden machinery underneath every relationship you have ever had, every system you have ever trusted, every version of the world you were raised to believe in. By the time this is over, that machinery will be visible to you, and you will never be able to stop seeing it. That is not a comfortable thing to promise, but it is an honest one. The year is 1513. The place is a farmhouse outside Florence, the kind of place that feels like the end of something, like a room where ambitions go to die quietly. A man sits at a desk in that house. He is 44 years old. His body carries the memory of what was done to it. Not long ago, he was one of the most consequential figures in Italian politics, the Secretary of the Florentine Republic, a man who had sat face to face with kings and warlords and never once blinked. Then the political wind shifted. The Medici family reclaimed Florence, and with it, they reclaimed everything. He was arrested, accused of plotting against them, an accusation built from nothing, from rumor and fear and the convenient need for a scapegoat. What happened next was not a trial, it was a performance. They used a torture method called the strappato. The prisoner's wrists are bound behind their back. Then they are hoisted into the air by those same bound wrists, suspended and dropped, not to the floor, just far enough that the body's own weight tears the shoulders apart at the joint. And then they do it again, and again. He was dropped 6 times. He confessed nothing because there was nothing to confess. When they were finished with him, they did not execute him. They did something some would argue is crueler. They released him, took his title, took his office, took the work that had defined his entire adult life, and sent him to rot on a small, struggling piece of land that had been in his family for generations. A farm that barely fed itself, far from the city that had once needed him. Most people at this point would have surrendered. Not necessarily to despair. Some surrendered to bitterness, which is really just despair wearing a proud face. To drink, to the slow erosion of days that no longer hold any meaning, and to the comfortable numbness of a man who tells himself the world did not deserve him anyway. Machiavelli did not surrender, and the proof of that is in a letter he wrote to a friend named Francesco Vittori around this time. It is one of the most remarkable letters in recorded history, not because of what it says about political philosophy, but because of what it says about what a human being can choose to be when circumstance has stripped away everything else. He described his days, the mornings spent managing a property that was falling apart around him, the afternoons at a tavern in the village, playing cards with the butcher, the miller, men whose world was small and whose conversation matched it. He was not above them, not in that letter. He sat with them. He argued. He laughed too loud over games that meant nothing. But then evening came, and this is where the letter changes entirely. He wrote, "On the coming of evening, I return to my house and enter my study. At the door, I take off the day's clothing, covered with mud and dust, and put on garments regal and courtly, and reclothed appropriately. I enter the ancient courts of ancient men." He changed his clothes every night, not for an audience, not for approval, for himself, because he had decided, in the wreckage of his life, that the conversation he was about to have with the minds of Livy and Cicero and Thucydides was worthy of his full presence. That intellectual dignity was the one thing they could not confiscate. And in that study, on those evenings, he wrote the book that would outlive every person who had tried to destroy him, not as revenge, as testimony. The first thing Machiavelli understood, the thing that anchors everything else he ever wrote, is something almost no one wants to hear. The world does not run on goodness. It never has. Goodness is what we tell children so they sleep peacefully, what we tell ourselves so we can tolerate the morning. But when you strip away the stories we wrap around reality, what you find underneath is a system that runs on something far more reliable than virtue. It runs on interest. He observed that a man will forget the death of his father long before he forgets the loss of what his father left behind. Mourn your losses, yes, but watch what people actually do when the grief fades, and you will see what they are truly made of. They circle back to what was taken from them, the inheritance, the standing, the thing that cost them something they cannot recover. Grief is human, but grievance is primal. He pushed this further and wrote something that got him condemned by the church and turned into a monster by everyone who did not want the truth spoken plainly. He wrote that men are, by nature, inclined toward their own interests above all else, and that they will behave well only when they are compelled to, or when behaving well costs them nothing. Now stop before you flinch. He was not making a moral argument. He was making an observation the way a doctor makes an observation, not to judge the patient, but to understand the condition. Think about water. Water does not choose to flow downhill. It does not decide to take the path of least resistance. It simply follows the nature of what it is. And if you understand that, you do not curse the river when it floods. You build accordingly. You choose where you build. You account for what water does, because what water does is not a surprise. It is physics. Human self-interest operates the same way. Under normal conditions, with enough comfort and enough to lose, people cooperate. They keep their promises. They are loyal. They are generous. They look, for all the world, like the decent human beings you need them to be. But change the conditions. Remove the comfort. Raise the stakes high enough. Push the pressure to the point where it is their survival against yours. And watch what happens. This is not cynicism. It is architecture. Build your understanding of people on what they consistently do under pressure, not on what they say when pressure is absent. And suddenly, the world becomes far less shocking. The friend who disappears when you truly need them. The partner who rewrites history the moment it suits them. The colleague who smiles at you and stabs at the first opportunity. You did not misread them. You simply had not yet seen them under enough pressure to know who they actually were. Machiavelli would look at your surprise and say, gently, without cruelty, that you had been testing the wrong conditions. He was 25 years old when Florence gave him his first master class. The Medici family had ruled the city for 6 decades, 60 years of art, of patronage, of celebrating Florentine greatness. They had funded the Renaissance. They had made Florence the most culturally magnificent city in Europe, and the people had loved them for it, or so it appeared. Then Charles VIII of France came south with 30,000 soldiers, and the entire architecture of that love collapsed in a single afternoon. Piero de' Medici, Lorenzo's son, rode out to meet the French king. He did not ride out to defend Florence. He rode out to surrender it, to hand over the city's fortresses, its access points, and its strategic positions, in exchange for being allowed to keep his own skin intact. By the time he returned to Florence, the gates were already closing against him. The same citizens who had cheered his family, who had crowded the streets for their festivals, who had praised their name for a generation, turned on them with a velocity that would have seemed impossible the day before. The Medici palace was stripped. The family was thrown out of the city they had made legendary. No one mourned the art. No one spoke of the festivals. They were gone before the dust had settled. Machiavelli watched this and filed it away, not with bitterness, not with satisfaction, but with the cold attention of a man who is learning something true about the world and intends never to forget it. What he learned is this: loyalty is not a character trait. It is a calculation. And like all calculations, it changes when the variables change. The people who love you today love the version of circumstances in which loving you is easy, safe, and perhaps even beneficial. That is not false love. That is just human love, which has always been more conditional than the songs suggest. The question is not whether this is true. It is. The question is whether you build your life knowing it, or whether you keep building on a foundation you have never honestly tested. At some point in his writing, Machiavelli introduced 2 concepts that I want you to hold carefully, because they are the lens through which he understood everything. The first he called virtù. Not virtue in the religious sense, not goodness, not kindness. Virtù is the force inside a person that allows them to act decisively, skillfully, and without hesitation in a world that will not slow down for them. It is the combination of intelligence and courage and will. The thing that turns a plan into an outcome. The quality that separates the person who changes their circumstances from the person who is changed by them. The second he called Fortuna. And this one is harder to sit with. Fortuna is everything outside your control. The family you were born into, the era you arrived in, the disease that finds you, the opportunity that comes a decade too early or a decade too late, the mentor who never appears, the war that starts the year you were supposed to flourish. He said Fortuna is like a river in flood, enormous, indifferent. It does not aim at you. It does not hate you. It simply moves. And if you are in its path, you will be moved with it, or broken by it, or drowned beneath it. And then he said something that very few people are prepared to hear honestly. He said that roughly half of what happens in any human life is governed by Fortuna. Half. Half of your outcomes, your health, your timing, the conditions you were handed at birth, the accidents that shaped you before you were old enough to shape yourself. None of that was yours to decide. None of it is a reflection of your worth, or your effort, or your discipline. The other half, and only the other half, belongs to virtù. Now, here is where most people make the mistake that costs them everything. They spend their virtù, their actual capacity to act and build and change, on things that cannot be changed, on arguments that are already over, on relationships that have been finished for years, but no one has had the courage to bury, on careers that were never theirs to begin with, chosen to satisfy someone else's idea of who they should be. And then, when Fortuna comes, when the flood arrives, as it always does, they have nothing built, no reserves, no inner architecture, nothing that can hold. They stand in the open and hope the river is feeling generous. It is not. The only preparation that matters is building before you need what you have built, developing the skills, the clarity, and the relationships that can withstand real pressure before the pressure arrives and there is no longer time to prepare. A man named Francesco Sforza understood this completely. He was born in 1401 to a mercenary soldier. No title, no inheritance, and no name that opened doors. Just the combination of a sharp mind, a total absence of illusions, and a willingness to act at the precise moment when action would count. He spent decades making himself indispensable in the brutal chess game of Italian politics. He fought, he negotiated, he shifted alliances with the patience of a man who was not waiting for luck. He was engineering the conditions in which luck would have no choice but to arrive. And when the gap finally opened, he stepped through it and made himself Duke of Milan. Not given, taken, built. Machiavelli held him up, not because he admired ruthlessness, but because Sforza illustrated the fundamental law that power inherited is always temporary. Power constructed from the inside, from genuine capability, from real preparation, from the kind of virtù that does not depend on favorable conditions. That kind of power has roots. The lesson is not that you should become a warlord. The lesson is that anything given to you can be taken back. And the only things that cannot be taken are the ones you have grown inside yourself. Your judgment, your skills, and your ability to read people and situations with clarity. Those belong to you regardless of what the world decides to do next. There is an observation Machiavelli made about perception that most people hear and immediately misuse. He said that the world at large will only ever see your surface. What you appear to be is what you are to them, because they do not have access to anything deeper. They cannot read your intentions. They cannot measure your sincerity. They can only observe what you consistently project, what your actions over time suggest, and what other people say about you when you are somewhere else. The signal, in other words, is often all there is. Now, some people take this and decide it is a license for performance, for carefully constructed illusions, for managing impressions while the interior goes unattended. Machiavelli would say, with the patience of someone who has watched this fail repeatedly over centuries, that you are misreading him. Consider Agathocles, a man born so far from power he had clay on his hands as a child. His father was a potter in Sicily, and Agathocles climbed to become the ruler of Syracuse through methods that left no room for ambiguity. Betrayal, violence, the systematic elimination of everyone who stood between him and the position he wanted. He arrived. He held it for decades. And yet Machiavelli, examining his life, said, "This is not virtù." Because look at what Agathocles actually built. a reign maintained entirely by fear. An inner circle held together by the threat of what happened to people who stopped being useful. A man who slept every night of his life in a room full of people he could not fully trust, because he had constructed his world from materials that do not hold under pressure. Deception, terror, the constant maintenance of a lie that, if it ever cracked, would swallow him whole. He did not rule. He performed ruleship every single day, with no days off and no possibility of rest. That is not power. That is a prison you built yourself and then decorated to look like a palace. The actual insight, the one that matters, is that your surface and your substance must eventually match, not for moral reasons, for structural ones. Because the performance of competence, sustained over time without the competence underneath it, will crack. It always does. And when it does, there is nothing beneath it to save you. But when you spend your years building something real, real skill, real judgment, real character tested under real conditions, the surface takes care of itself. You do not have to manage impressions because there is nothing to hide. And a person with nothing to hide is one of the most dangerous things in any room. There is a pattern Machiavelli traced across every civilization he studied, and I want you to hear it as a warning, not about Rome or Florence, but about your own life, your own decade, your own quiet choices that are shaping something you cannot yet see clearly. Every great thing that human beings build follows the same arc. It begins in hardship, necessity. The early builders have no cushion, no margin for laziness. They are constructing something from bare ground, which means every mistake is expensive, and every lesson is paid for in blood or in failure, or in the cold clarity of a plan that did not survive contact with reality. From that struggle comes strength. From strength comes systems. From systems comes stability. And stability, over time, over generations, over the slow accumulation of comfort, becomes the very thing that unmakes what built it. Rome is the story Machiavelli returned to again and again. Not because he was nostalgic for empire, but because Rome illustrated the mechanism so perfectly, it functioned almost like a controlled experiment in human nature. At its height, Rome did not fall to invasion. The invasion was the final chapter of a story that had been unfolding from the inside for generations. Roman soldiers who had once been farmers, men who understood hunger and land and the weight of something being taken from you, became, over time, citizens who hired others to do the difficult things. The legions that had terrified the known world were replaced, gradually, with mercenaries. Men who fought for payment, not for the thing itself. Who could be bought and, therefore, could be bought away. The citizens ate. They were entertained. They were kept comfortable enough that discomfort began to feel like an insult rather than a teacher. And by the time the external threats arrived, and they always arrive, the internal architecture had already quietly given way. Now look at yourself. Where are you coasting? Where have you stopped asking hard questions because the comfort of not knowing is easier than the discomfort of the answer? Where has stability become stagnation in disguise? The friction you are avoiding, the difficult conversation, the discipline you keep postponing, the skill you tell yourself you will develop when things slow down. That friction is not the enemy of your growth. It is the source of it. The moment you eliminate all resistance from your life is the moment the rot begins. There is one more thing Machiavelli understood, and it might be the thing he understood most personally. He called it necessity. His argument was almost brutal in its simplicity. Comfort conceals character. A person who has never been pressed, never been cornered, and never had the safety nets pulled out from under them, that person does not know what they are made of. They cannot know. Nothing has ever demanded the answer. But press them, genuinely press them. Take away the options one by one until there is only the essential choice left, and you will see what was always there underneath. Either the capacity to rise or the absence of it. He studied the great figures of history and observed that the ones who endured, the ones whose names and ideas outlasted the empires they operated in, were almost without exception people who had been shaped by deprivation. Not people who had been given excellent conditions. People who had been given almost nothing and had therefore been forced to develop something inside themselves that could not be taken away. Moses did not lead a people out of comfort. Cyrus did not build an empire from a position of safety. The great leaders of the ancient world were not produced by favorable circumstances. They were revealed by unfavorable ones. Contrast that with Savonarola, the preacher who swept Florence with his moral fire, who had tens of thousands weeping in the streets, and who moved people the way only genuine conviction can. He had truth on his side, or at least he believed he did. He had the crowd. He had the pulpit. What he did not have was the capacity to compel. And when the political forces turned against him, when the words stopped being enough, he had nothing else. No structure, no power that was his own, just the voice. And when the voice was no longer welcome, everything ended. He was burned in the Piazza della Signoria, in the same square where he had once commanded the city. What Machiavelli extracted from this is something that sounds cold, but is actually mercy in disguise. Do not build your life exclusively on persuasion. Develop real capability, real leverage, the kind of foundation that holds even when the audience stops applauding. And perhaps most quietly, perhaps the truest thing of all, he wrote that there is wisdom in allowing yourself to be underestimated. That sometimes the most strategic thing a person can do is disappear from the expectations of others and use that invisibility to prepare. Because when the world is not watching, you can build without interference. Machiavelli lived this. 14 years in exile. 14 years of card games with butchers and long evenings in a study where no one was coming to celebrate him. He wrote plays. He corresponded with thinkers. He read everything. He refined his thinking into something so precise and so true that 500 years later, the people who tried to bury it are themselves buried, and his words are still cutting. He never saw it. He died in 1527, largely unknown beyond a small circle. The book that would define his name not yet published. He planted seeds in a field he would never live to harvest. And that is the thing I most want you to carry with you. Not the strategy, not the analysis of power, but the image of a man working night after night in a room no one cared about, on ideas the world was not yet ready for, with no assurance that any of it would ever matter. Working anyway, because the work was the answer to the question of who he was. And that question, who are you when no one is watching, when nothing is guaranteed, when the reward may never come? That is the only question that was ever worth asking. So let me tell you what I have come to believe after a long time spent with this man's ideas. You arrived in a world that was already in motion before you got here, and will continue long after you leave. It did not arrange itself around your arrival. It does not owe you the conditions you need to flourish. It will hand you circumstances you did not choose. A body, a family, an era, a set of starting conditions that are not fair, because fairness is a concept invented by human beings, and the universe predates us by a considerable margin. Roughly half of what shapes your life will be outside your hands entirely. That is not a tragedy. That is just the terms. The other half, the half that is yours, is everything. It is the only thing. And the question of how you use it is the question your life is actually answering, whether you are paying attention or not. Build your capacity before you need it. The time to dig wells is not when you are thirsty. Know your people, not by what they say, but by what they do when it costs them something to do it. Love is not a declaration. It is a pattern under pressure. Do not confuse motion for progress or comfort for safety. The stillest water is often the shallowest, and the place that feels most secure is frequently the place that has quietly stopped growing. Act, even imperfectly, even into uncertainty. Machiavelli believed, and I've come to believe he was right, that the universe is harsher on inaction than on wrong action. At least the wrong action generates something to learn from. The man who stands still generates only the slow accumulation of a life that never quite started. In that farmhouse, on those evenings, dressed in clothes too good for his circumstances, a broken man chose, again and again, to be larger than what had been done to him.